We know a lot about public opinion in Europe. In the last decades, we have learned what determines public support for Europe. We have also learned a lot about the determinants of lack of support for European integration. Furthermore, referendums and the current public mood in Europe are reminders that what the public thinks matters for the pace and scope of European integration. But not all what we seem to know is really finally actually correct. When we take a closer look at the data, we can see a far more nuanced picture. This is true for our understanding about the dynamics of public support for European integration. It is also true for what we believe how much individuals trust or do not trust the EU institutions. Also, a nuanced picture emerges when we examine more closely to what extent individuals are satisfied with democracy in the EU and satisfied with democracy on the national level. And coming perhaps to the most important question for any political system, we have surprisingly few studies that look at the reciprocal link between public opinion and EU policy making. Here, our common notion is that for sure we don't expect a link between public opinion and EU decision makers. On the one hand, we are skeptical if the public is aware and responds to decisions on the EU level, and on the other hand, many believe that policymakers on the EU level are not paying much attention to what the public wants. I will briefly present some empirical analysis to examine to what extent the data we have confirms these common notions. A common understanding is that since the Maastricht Treaty, the public has increasingly become skeptic about the EU. But if we take a closer look at the answers of the respondents from the Eurobarometer question, we don't necessarily see such a trend. Here I have plotted the different answers to the question. Generally speaking, do you think that your country's membership in the EU is a good thing, bad thing, neither nor, or don't know? Clearly, we can see that the number of individuals who thought that the EU membership was a good thing steadily rose from around the 1980s. As the EU was developing the single market, the public clearly was responding positively. We know with the Maastricht Treaty there is a drop of support, roughly back to the level of what it was prior to the push of the single market. But since 1991, support clearly has not been further eroding. Also, the number of people who think that EU membership is bad is remarkably stable across time. But one thing that you do clearly see is that the individuals who previously thought that EU membership was good have changed to thinking that EU membership is neither good nor bad. So these people are not opposed to EU membership, but rather these individuals are ambivalent if EU membership is good or not. Often we hear the statement that citizens just don't trust the EU institutions. Such statements again miss the nuances that emerge when one looks at the data more carefully. Here we have plotted the average trust of citizens over time by country against the grand mean. Clearly we can see that there are quite some differences in the level of trust across countries. Most countries are above the average line, and among those, slightly more than half are from the new member states. In fact, with the exception of Latvia, the public in all of the new member states have a relatively high level of trust in the EU institutions. Among the group of countries that has a public with less trust in the EU, we find mostly Scandinavian countries, such as Denmark, Finland, and Sweden, and large countries such as France, Germany, and the UK. Then how has the trust in the EU institutions evolved over time? And is there variation across the different institutions of the EU? Here we have plotted the predicted probabilities of people trusting a given EU institution at a given point in time. Several things we can see clearly. As the EU as an institution is maturing and changing over time, the trust in the EU institutions is increasing for all institutions except the Council of Ministers. For the Council, as time progresses, people tend to trust this institution less. Also, in recent years, we see an interesting intersection of all the lines. From this, we can clearly see that the differences in trust across the EU institutions have become smaller and smaller. among the public, the EU institutions are either collectively blamed or collectively praised. In people's minds, the EU institutions are not sufficiently differentiated. By and large, all institutions together begin to represent one and the same thing. An even more nuanced picture emerges when we look at predicted probabilities of trust in the EU institutions by the number of years a country was a member of the EU. Clearly, we can see the longer a country has been a member of the EU, the more likely it is that individuals of such a country will trust the EU institutions. Again, we often hear the notion that satisfaction with democracy in the EU is declining. If we look at the data, quite a different picture emerges. This graph plots the likelihood of an individual being satisfied with democracy in the EU and the member states through time. We can see that as the EU institutions are changing through time, the public becomes increasingly satisfied with democracy in the EU. Satisfaction of democracy on the national level is neither increasing nor decreasing. It's relatively constant through time. Now, if we look at the data through the lens of the member states clustered by the years that they have been members of the EU, we can clearly see differences across the groups. Individuals in countries that have been members of the EU for very recently are on the whole far more satisfied with democracy in the EU. On the other hand, individuals in countries that have been members of the EU for a long time are far less satisfied. Additional research on the determinants of these differences suggests that people in the old member states view the EU and the domestic level as overlapping. In the new member states, individuals clearly separate both levels. Often, distrust in domestic institutions increases the likelihood of trusting the EU institutions. Coming to the question about the degree of political representation in the EU, we know for any democratic system to work, there needs to be a reciprocal link between the public and policymakers. On the one hand, the public needs to be aware and respond to what policymakers are doing. And on the other hand, policymakers need to take into account the preferences of the public. Here we turn to the question if the public responds to what policymakers are doing in Brussels. We look at this question in the aggregate on the EU level. We also examine this on the country level to see if there are differences in public responsiveness by country. Here we plot the odds ratio for our analysis. In this graph we can see that there is public responsiveness on the EU level. We can see such an effect on the aggregate level in the EU. But furthermore, we can observe the very same public responsiveness also on the country level. The public in all countries are responding to what policymakers are doing on the EU level. We seem to be observing publics that are clearly watching the activities on the EU level. Now, we turn to the question do policymakers respond to public opinion? And the results of our analysis indicate that there's a small degree of policy representation. However, it takes a long time for policymakers to represent public preferences in European policy. This graph plots the half-life of policy preferences of the public. In the EU, it takes 8 years for half of what the public wants to be represented by policy. In comparison, the half-life is 2 years in the UK, 3 years in the US, and 4 years in Canada. So in the EU, policy representation is limited, and it takes a long time. So the dynamics that we have observed in the empirical analysis that I have presented today is that the public is not more skeptic about EU integration. Instead, the public is more ambivalent. Countries vary in how much trust individuals have in the EU institutions and how satisfied they are with EU democracy. There is public responsiveness to what policymakers do, so individuals clearly are watching the European Union and are clearly watching the activities on the European Union level. But there is only limited policy representation, and that, to the degree that it happens, takes a long time.